Jefferson, so Canadian canola oil and meal is being hit with a 100% tariff. Canola meal is a byproduct of canola oil extraction. It's primarily used as feed ingredients for livestock.
We're leading because of tariffs. We're leading because of talent, and this is where they'd like to be. But without the tariffs, we wouldn't have a chance because we wouldn't be able to protect those investments of the companies coming in.
What if I told you the greatest threat to America's industrial future isn't China, Russia, or even the Middle East, but our closest ally, Canada, quietly pulling the strings for generations? Americans have been taught to see Canada as the neighbor who never makes trouble, polite, reliable, forever aligned with Washington. Textbooks framed the border as the longest, undefended boundary in the world. Politicians celebrated the partnership as a model of shared values and prosperity. That image, comfortable and reassuring, was more than a story. It was a myth that came crashing down the moment Canada decided it had been lied to one time too many. The turning point traces back to Washington under President Donald Trump. In rally after rally, he promised that America First would bring factories roaring back to life. He claimed unfair deals had drained jobs from American towns, and he pledged to rewrite the rules so that U.S. workers would never again be cheated. The applause lines were simple, powerful, and intoxicating, but buried beneath the rhetoric was a decision that would rupture the trust of America's closest ally. Trump declared Canadian aluminum and steel a national security threat. The logic was flimsy. Canada had supplied U.S. industries for decades, fueling cars in Detroit, airplanes in Seattle, and skyscrapers in New York. Canadian smelters operated under some of the toughest environmental standards in the world. But the administration insisted that imports from Canada endangered American security, slapping tariffs on billions of dollars worth of goods to Ottawa. This wasn't just about trade. It was betrayal. Canada had stood with the United States in 2 world wars, in Korea, in Afghanistan. Canadian intelligence worked hand in glove with American agencies. Canadian resources had kept U.S. industries alive during global shortages. Yet here was Washington branding Canada as a danger, twisting numbers to justify punishment. Trump repeated the falsehoods again and again. He pointed to supposed deficits that did not exist. He claimed American workers were being bled dry by their northern neighbor. None of it held up under scrutiny. Fact-checkers debunked the claims, but the damage was done. A narrative of deception had hardened across North America. The reaction was visceral. Canadian newspapers accused Washington of treating a trusted ally like an expendable pawn. Union leaders in Ontario warned that American rhetoric was poisoning decades of cooperation. In the U.S., farmers who sold grain across the border suddenly questioned whether they could rely on the neighbor they had always called friends. Editorial boards from Toronto to Chicago described the atmosphere with one word: betrayal. For ordinary families, the anger was not abstract. It was the realization that trust between neighbors had been deliberately broken. And then, in Ottawa, the dam finally broke. Prime Minister Mark Carney, facing American negotiators across a long mahogany table, delivered words that no Canadian leader had ever dared speak so bluntly. Canada will no longer be coerced. The sentence was calm, measured, but it hit like a thunderclap. For Canadians watching at home, the effect was electric. Television networks replayed the clip on loop. Social media erupted. Hashtags like #StandWithCarney and #BuyCanadian trended nationwide within hours. A columnist for the Globe and Mail wrote, "For the first time in decades, Canadians see themselves not as America's junior partner, but as a nation standing tall in its own right." Across the border, shockwaves rippled through Washington. Lawmakers had grown used to Canadian compliance, a reflexive nod of agreement in every dispute. Suddenly, that reflex was gone. A trusted ally was asserting leverage, leverage rooted not in rhetoric, but in hard resources. Consider what was at stake. America's aerospace sector depends on Canadian aluminum, prized for its purity and consistency. U.S. Auto manufacturing relies on Canadian steel, hydroelectric power from Quebec light cities in the Northeast. Pipelines and grids tie the two economies together more tightly than most Americans realize. With one defiant sentence, Carney had reminded the world that those lifelines were not permanent. They were conditional, and Canada held the switch. International observers wasted no time drawing conclusions. The Financial Times ran the headline, "Canada Breaks the Silence," in Tokyo. The Asahi Shimbun compared Carney's stance to Japan's post-war struggle to shake off dependence on Washington. In Berlin, analysts noted the echoes of Europe's calls for strategic sovereignty. A French commentator quipped, "If even Canada can resist the United States, who can't?" The symbolism was impossible to miss. America's myth of unshakable alliances had fractured, not at the hands of adversaries like Beijing or Moscow, but because a friendly neighbor had grown tired of lies. Carney's refusal didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years of frustration, a response to repeated deception. Washington's false claims had painted Canada into a corner, and Ottawa decided it was safer to risk confrontation than to keep swallowing humiliation. The retaliation came swiftly. Within a week, Ottawa unveiled the first stage of what commentators would dub the blackout strategy, a $15 billion Arctic security package, new icebreakers to patrol the Northwest Passage, advanced surveillance systems scanning northern waters, expanded bases in Inuit communities. Officially, these moves were about protecting sovereignty in the Arctic, but everyone knew they were also a signal. Canada was done playing the junior partner. For Canadians, the message was exhilarating. Editorials called it a coming of age. Polls showed overwhelming support for standing firm. One veteran told a reporter in Toronto, "We fought beside the Americans for generations, but now we're finally fighting for ourselves." For Americans, the implications were chilling. The blackout wasn't literal, yet. But the metaphor was plain. Every plane, every car, every building that depended on Canadian materials was now exposed. The lights in American factories still burned, but everyone understood that their glow depended on goodwill north of the border. This was no longer a dispute over tariffs. It was the unraveling of trust itself. Lies had consequences, and those consequences had come home. By the close of that week, the mood in Washington was unmistakable, a mixture of disbelief and unease. Analysts who had once dismissed Canada as harmless now warned of vulnerability. "Our greatest exposure isn't China," one think tank wrote, "it's Canada, and we've been blind to it." The myth of eternal harmony had been shattered. And Americans, for the first time, were forced to confront a question they had never dared to ask. What if the ally they counted on most had just walked away? The silence inside American factories began with a flicker. Conveyor belts slowed. Orders were delayed. Then, one by one, plants went dark. By the end of the first quarter, the data was undeniable. Industrial output in the United States had collapsed to levels not seen since the depths of the Great Recession. In Ohio, the Mahoning Valley, once the beating heart of steel, stood as a monument to decay. Empty lots where mills had hummed for generations were now littered with weeds. In Michigan, auto plants slashed shifts, citing shortages of high-grade aluminum that could no longer be sourced affordably. In Pennsylvania, glass manufacturers warned they would shut down entire facilities unless supply chains stabilized. The layoffs rippled outward. touching trucking companies, repair shops, and diners whose morning rush once depended on factory workers grabbing coffee before a shift. The numbers told a grim story. Nearly 1.2 million manufacturing jobs evaporated in less than 18 months. Economists compared the scale to the offshoring waves of the 1980s. But this time, the losses weren't moving abroad. They were vanishing altogether. Small towns, once anchored by a single factory, became ghost towns overnight. Storefronts closed, houses lost half their value, and schools faced budget crises as tax revenues evaporated. In Midland, Michigan, the Martinez family sold their home for barely half of what they had paid just 5 years earlier. With the local auto parts plant shuttered, they could no longer cover mortgage payments. Their children's school cut art and music programs after funding dried up, and the town council announced it would close the public library indefinitely for neighbors. The changes were devastating symbols. The collapse was not only about jobs or wages, but about the very institutions that made community life possible. For ordinary Americans, the crisis was felt not in statistics, but in prices. A pickup truck that cost $40,000 the year before suddenly demanded $55,000. Beer brewed in Milwaukee soared in price as cans became scarce. Appliances, from refrigerators to washing machines, doubled in cost. Even construction-stalled contractors reported projects delayed for months because steel beams were impossible to source without paying ruinous premiums. The pain extended beyond the industrial belt. In Arizona and Nevada, solar companies struggled to expand because panels required alloys that had once flowed cheaply from Canadian smelters. In Florida, home builders canceled developments, unable to afford skyrocketing material costs. Inflation was no longer an abstract policy debate. It was a lived reality, eroding paychecks, draining savings, and fueling anger. Small businesses suffered most. Family-owned machine shops, dependent on steady contracts, folded under the weight of input costs. Farmers who relied on affordable equipment and packaging saw margins disappear. In Iowa, one cooperative reported that the cost of storing and shipping grain had doubled. "We're not just squeezed," a farmer told local radio. "We're crushed." Meanwhile, across the border, Canada was writing a different story. Freed from the weight of America's demands, Canadian producers surged. Aluminum exports to Europe rose by 27% in a single year. Steel flowed eastward to Japan and South Korea, where buyers eager for stable partners signed long-term contracts. Canadian negotiators inked a sweeping deal with the European Union, promising preferential access for everything from raw materials to finished goods. What looked like a collapse in Detroit was opportunity in Toronto. Multinational corporations began shifting supply chains northward. Betting that Canada offered stability Washington could no longer guarantee. In Vancouver, new logistics hubs sprang up almost overnight. Montreal's port expanded, handling record volumes of transatlantic cargo. Canadian employment in heavy industry reached highs not seen since the post-war boom. The cultural shift was just as stark. A grassroots Buy Canadian movement swept the country. Billboards in Calgary and Ottawa urged consumers to support sovereignty through shopping. Grocery chains highlighted domestic brands with pride. Fashion labels marketed themselves not with European flair, but with the promise of homegrown resilience. What had begun as a political standoff transformed into a consumer identity. Foreign investors noticed. Sovereign wealth funds from the Middle East poured billions into Canadian infrastructure. Asian electronics giants scouted sites for new factories in Ontario. The World Bank published a report dubbing Canada the new anchor of North Atlantic manufacturing. In diplomatic circles, The phrase stuck. Back in the United States, resentment deepened. Governors begged Washington for relief, warning that states faced irreversible decline. Truckers marched on state capitals, protesting fuel costs that ate away their livelihoods. Construction unions organized rallies, demanding answers for why projects had dried up. Yet, at every podium, politicians struggled to explain how the world's richest country had become so dependent, so vulnerable, so unprepared. The paradox was hard to miss. America had claimed strength through tariffs. Instead, it had exposed weakness by pushing away its closest supplier. It had strangled its own industries, and every day that Canada signed another deal, the distance between the two economies widened. Canada, for its part, leaned into its new role. Ottawa unveiled subsidies to modernize factories, expand rail corridors, and accelerate port construction. Policymakers spoke not of survival, but of leadership. "We are not filling America's gap," one minister declared. "We are building a new center of gravity." The Arctic, long dismissed as frozen wilderness, became a symbol of this ambition. Shipping routes shortened by melting ice offered Canada a pathway to connect Asia and Europe directly. New ice-class vessels carried goods under Canadian flags. Mining projects in the north, once marginal, suddenly drew interest from foreign investors eager to secure resources. The idea that Canada was simply a resource appendage of the United States was gone. By the end of the second year, the scoreboard was stark. U.S. industrial output had contracted by nearly 15%. Canada had expanded by 9%. American workers lined up at unemployment offices. Canadian workers lined up at job fairs. In Washington, hearings turned into shouting matches. In Ottawa, parliamentarians debated how to manage an unexpected surplus. For ordinary Americans, none of this felt like geopolitics. It felt like the lights turning off in their own lives. A father in Michigan described sitting with his kids in the dark after power was cut because he couldn't pay the bill. A teacher in Wisconsin spoke of students coming to class hungry because parents had lost jobs. "It's not abstract," she said. "It's our daily life." And yet, for Canadians, the mood was different. Pride mixed with a sense of inevitability. "We've always been told we were too small to matter," one young worker in Hamilton said. "Now we see that when we stand our ground, the world comes to us." The contrast could not have been sharper. America's factories dimmed, Canada's burned brighter. What began as a standoff had become a reversal of fortunes, and with each passing month, it was harder to imagine the balance tipping back. By the third year of the standoff, the crisis was no longer measured only in jobs lost or prices paid. It was measured in the fraying fabric of American society. The numbers were one story. The mood on the streets was another. In cities from Minneapolis to Phoenix, protests grew more frequent and more volatile. Truckers parked rigs across interstate highways, demanding relief from fuel prices. Teachers marched for emergency funding as local tax bases collapsed. In Portland, a march that began with workers calling for wage support ended in clashes with police after power outages left neighborhoods in the dark. Local officials admitted privately that they no longer had the resources to contain unrest if it spread. For young Americans, the sense of betrayal was sharper still. Surveys showed that more than half of people under 30 believed they would be worse off than their parents. College graduates carried debt they could not repay, entering job markets that no longer existed. In interviews, they spoke not of ambition but of escape. "I'm applying for visas in Europe." One recent graduate from Illinois said, "I don't think America has a future for me." Inside Washington, another battle was brewing, one that carried consequences even more devastating than street protests. In a case originating from Delaware, a federal court had already ruled that the administration's emergency tariffs violated the Constitution. The executive branch, judges said, had no authority to impose sweeping duties without Congress. That decision set the stage for a Supreme Court showdown unlike any in recent memory. At stake was not simply policy, it was money. $210 billion in tariff revenue that would have to be refunded if the ruling were upheld. Treasury officials scrambled to calculate options, but the math was merciless. The government's operating cash balance hovered around $800 billion, much of it already allocated. Carving out nearly a quarter of that sum overnight would shred the budget and trigger a liquidity crisis. Bond markets saw the danger first. Yields spiked to levels unseen since the 1970s. For ordinary households, the ripple effects were immediate. Mortgage rates soared, credit card interest climbed, and small businesses suddenly faced loan renewals at double the previous cost. The language of bond yields and liquidity, crises became painfully real at kitchen tables, where families struggled to reconcile higher bills with shrinking paychecks. Foreign creditors, especially in Asia, began hedging against the risk of default. Behind closed doors, some creditors whispered what had once been unthinkable, demanding repayment not in paper but in assets, leases on strategic ports, rights to mineral extraction, even stakes in critical infrastructure. The language was clinical, but the implication was brutal. America, the world's creditor of last resort, could soon be carved up like a bankrupt estate. This is how empires die. One leaked report from a Wall Street bank declared, not through war, but through creditors enforcing terms on an empire that can no longer enforce its own. History offered grim precedents. Rome fell not only to invaders but to financial exhaustion. Its treasuries drained, its legions unpaid. The British Empire unraveled under the weight of debts accumulated during 2 world wars, selling assets abroad to stay afloat. The Soviet Union, once a military giant, collapsed when its economy could no longer sustain promises to its citizens. In each case, the story was not sudden conquest, but slow erosion from within. America now seemed to be following the same script, yet amid the gloom. Experts pointed out that survival was possible, but only if Washington made a choice. One path was confrontation, doubling down on tariffs, ignoring court rulings, printing money to cover debts. That path might buy time, but it risked inflation, social collapse, and the permanent loss of credibility. The other path was reinvention, investing in technologies that could reduce dependence on foreign inputs and rebuild resilience at home. Desalination technology, once dismissed as too expensive, had matured. Countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia were already using it to supply large portions of their populations. Large-scale recycling systems could reclaim water and materials that America currently wasted, turning liabilities into assets. Atmospheric water generation, machines pulling humidity straight from the air, was no longer science fiction. Prototypes were already supplying villages in arid regions. The question was not whether the solutions existed. It was whether leaders had the humility to pursue them. But humility was in short supply. Politicians traded blame across aisles. Governors accused Washington of negligence. Washington accused Canada of betrayal. Meanwhile, the clock ticked. The Supreme Court's decision was due in just 150 days. Investors circled that date on calendars. Protest organizers did too. The countdown became a national obsession, a reminder that the crisis was no longer distant. It was imminent. In Ottawa, leaders spoke with calm confidence. Trade flows with Europe and Asia continued to rise. Canadian industries hummed. Diplomats quietly noted that Canada was now treated as a serious power in global forums, no longer a shadow of Washington. The irony was sharp by standing firm. Canada had achieved the recognition it had been denied for generations. In Washington, by contrast, the mood bordered on panic. Treasury officials warned of systemic risk. Generals studied scenarios of domestic unrest. Governors begged for federal bailouts they knew would never come. The myth of invincibility had cracked, and with it, faith in the future. Every empire faces such a moment. The moment when allies no longer fear saying no. The moment when creditors demand more than promises. The moment when citizens stop believing in tomorrow. For America, that moment had arrived. The question was simple, yet terrifying. Would the country choose confrontation and drift toward decline? Or would it embrace reinvention before the countdown expired, viewers? This is where you come in. What do you believe is America's path forward? Is it denial, clinging to power that is already slipping away? Or is it humility, rebuilding alliances, and investing in technologies that could secure resilience for generations Canadians? Are you ready for the responsibility that comes with leadership, Americans? Are you ready for the reckoning that comes with arrogance? The countdown is real. 150 days until the court delivers a verdict that could shake the foundations of American power. And as that deadline looms, the world is watching not just Canada's blackout strategy, but whether America still has the light to lead. If this opened your eyes, subscribe, hit like, and join the conversation in the comments. Tell me, who do you think will define North America's future? America trying to cling to dominance, or Canada rising with a new kind of power? The decision is coming, and it won't wait.